Good morning and bonjour, and thank you all for coming. Before we start, I want to mention that there will be translation. So if you need translation, please use your headphones. Okay. Once again, good morning. My name is Phil Duffy. I'm the president and executive director of the Woods Hole Research Center, and we're co-sponsoring the event here this morning. Before we start, I want to take a moment and discuss, mention the events of yesterday. I'm sure you're all struggling, as I am, to digest what happened yesterday in the United States. I'm sure you're all wondering, as I am, what the consequences of this will be. And in particular, I'm sure you're all wondering, as I am, what this will mean for the future of United States participation in the international climate process, and even for the future of that process itself. And of course, we can't know any of these things yet. But I want to remind you of one thing that we do know. And we do know that the work that we are doing here collectively today and for the rest of the next 2 weeks, and the work that we all do at our home institutions takes on new importance starting today, starting right now. If the United States government is going to step back, that means we all have to step up. Political events do not and cannot change the reality of climate change. And the reality is that we need urgently to stop the use of fossil fuels. We need urgently to halt the destruction of forests. And that's what this event here today is about. And beyond this, as I'm sure you all understand, we need to actually remove large quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And again, land management and forests in particular, which are the subject of this event, can and will play an important role here. So we all have important work to do, and we need to get on with it. And what I'm going to do now is turn the floor over to my colleague, Dave McGlinchey. Dave is going to introduce today's panel and moderate the discussion. Thank you once again for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. The format we have is 3 initial speakers who will address remote sensing and forest monitoring, and then we'll move to a panel question and answer format for the last portion of the event. After that, we have refreshments outside. Please stay, join us, talk to the speakers, ask any additional questions you might have. So thank you all for coming. Despite the circumstances that we meet under with the election last night, we are excited today to talk about the current and future state of forest monitoring. We know that forest degradation and deforestation is a major contributor to climate change, and as the Paris Agreement indicated, forest management can be a big part of the solution. But Paris was the COP of agreement, and this is the COP of action, of figuring out how to actually get that done. So if forest management is going to be a climate change solution using mechanisms like REDD, then we need to be able to accurately measure what is happening on the ground. To talk about that, we have a great panel of experts who are doing the important work on the front lines of forest monitoring and deforestation, and scientists who are pushing the boundaries into the next generation of technology. The topic of this event is beyond deforestation, and we're moving there to a more nuanced state of forest monitoring that will allow us to reduce uncertainty on the forest carbon component of the carbon cycle. Our first speaker is Dr. Landing Mane. who is the director of the Satellite Observatory of Central African Forests, known as OSFAC. Landing has been at OSFAC since 2009. He has 20 years of experience in various fields, including soil science and agriculture, food security, sustainable development, environmental and social assessment, remote sensing and GIS, statistics, climate change, and REDD+. Dr. Mane holds a PhD in physical geography and environment from Strasbourg University in France, and did postdoctorate work in natural resources and remote sensing at the Department of Environmental Science at the University of Louvain-la-Neuve. Thank you. Sorry. He will talk about the current work being done where he is located in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Okay. Bonjour à tous. Good morning. So I am a French speaker, but my presentation will be in English. So sometimes it will be broken English, but maybe you will understand what I want to say. So I'm going to talk about forest loss in Congo Basin, mainly in DRC. Why in DRC? Because Congo Basin is the most big block of forest after Amazonia. And also we have many challenges in this area of Africa. So Congo, DRC is 155 million of hectares of forest and half of humid forest of Africa. So it's a big space of forest. So before that, I want to talk about our organization, OSFAC. OSFAC is a satellite observatory of Central African Forest. We are based in DRC, and we cover all Central African area. And our activities are focused in 3 domains: capacity building, satellite data dissemination we receive from partners, and forest monitoring with our collaborators, mainly US partners. And OSFAC is supported by USAID, European Union, and others partners, and technical support from University of Maryland and NASA, because we are in the same consortium with NASA. So OSFAC is involved in CARPE program. CARPE is the Central African Regional Program of Environment, and CARPE aims is to maintain the ecological integrity of the humid forest in Congo Basin. And also, CARPE supports the planning and the management of forests in the Congo Basin. And CARPE activities is focused in landscapes, and we have 6 landscapes in DRC. It's Salonga, Epulu, Maiko, Lac Tele, Lac Tumba, and Virunga. Here is a localization of this landscape. We have 3 in the east of DRC, 2 in the central, it's Maringa, Lokore, and Salonga, and 1 in the west, it's Lac Tumba landscapes. So, as you may know, deforestation is one of our problems in the Central African region. We can see in this DRC map, the brown and red is a deforestation between 2000 and to 2014. So the deforestation grew up in this area of Africa. Every year we lose thousand hectares of forests in Central African countries. We can see here the change between 2000 and 2015 in the Maringa, Lokore, Wamba landscapes. This is a Ituri landscape. You can see also changes, because changes is very, very short. Between 2010 and 2015, we lose many thousands of hectares of forest. So this graphic summarizes the trend of forest loss in landscape, in CARPE landscape. So as you can see, in the top we have Virunga. Virunga is the protected area of DRC, but in the Syria, due to civil war, many population move to these parks, and with this human pressure, we have the deforestation and forest loss in this protected area. And the second one is another protected area, is Maiko and Lactele Lactumba. In this two part of landscape, the pressure is due to agriculture, slash and burn agriculture, and population growth. And as you may know, civil war has impact in forest loss, because many of people move to forest to protected area, because it's easy in this area to find food, collect food, but also for poaching. What are the main drivers of deforestation? We have slash and burn, and we have logging, firewood, mining, and bushfire. It's why in my presentation I will focus on fire impact on deforestation and forest loss in the DRC. What is the fire impact on carbon loss and emission also? This is one example of two landscapes, Lactele, Lactumba, and Maiko. You can see fire density and fire distribution. And as you can see, we find the same area of deforestation. It is located at the protected area. In this protected area, you have deforestation and loss of forest. And also in Lactele, Lactumba, this forest loss is due to slash and burn agriculture. We have many savanna also in this area of country. This is a point of active point of fire. By using satellite images, MODIS satellite images, we try to know, to see where we have many fire and what is the impact of fire. This is active fire, the number of active fire in the landscape. In the same area, you can see it's Lactele Lactumba, is Virunga. Virunga is an important park because it's important protected area, because it's the heritage of UNESCO. So, but we have many people coming in this protected area, and the consequences is forest loss. And the second one is Lactele Lactumba. Lactumba, we have grazing, but we have also many activities of slash and burn agriculture. So we have this fire. The consequence is emission and loss of carbon. This data is come from Baccini, Alessandro Baccini work. So we extract carbon loss in landscapes of carpe. So how people use this information? We have all this data. How people can use this information? By combining some parameters, we can advise for land use, but also for red policies. You can see in this map, this DRC provinces, boundaries, and by combining carbon and deforestation, we can lead and you can advise to people and actors to choose the best area for red process project. In some area, maybe we have to make reforestation, and for others area, maybe it's better to have conservation and ecotourism. And for others area, maybe we can combine conservation, ecotourism, and reforestation. So you can see that all our data can use to advise land use, but also for red policies. So we know that also the consequences of forest loss is not only for climate, increase of emission or loss of carbon. We have also the loss of biodiversity. We try to check what is the consequences of forest loss in biodiversity. What you see here, we make projection from now to 2024 in DRC. We will lose habitat of some species like bonobos, like birds, like chimpanzees. So bonobos, you may know, bonobos is a nearest human animal. So we are losing his habitat in DRC. So it's important for us to monitor this habitat. So you can see that here, we in Virunga protected area, we lose 7% of habitat of chimpanzee. In Virunga also for birds, we will lose 5%, and for bonobos in Maringa Lopori Wamba, when the landscape, we lose 3%. So this is the consequences of forest loss in Congo Basin, in DRC. Impact in climate change, but impact also in biodiversity. The conclusion is that in DRC landscapes, 18% of forest loss caused by fire, and we'll lose also the carbon loss. Loss is around more than 10 million of forests, and also you can see carbon emission and projection made for habitat lost. But you have also challenges for this area. Challenges is how to adhere people to continue to protect forests, because they are the first protector of forests in this area. So we have to involve it in all programs, in all projects for forest protection. Also, the second one is degradation. In this area, we have many information, many data on deforestation, but no many data on degradation. So maybe actually you have to focus studies on degradation, because degradation is one of parameter of REDD+. So I think that Woodhold Resources is doing it. So it will be one topic of one presentation, I think. Before I conclude, I want to thank our partner, DRC officials, USAID for supporting us financially, USAID and CARPE, I mean, University of Maryland, NASA, because OSFAC is part of a consortium of this big institution to help us in technical support. You can find information, all this information in our website, osfac.net. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Landing. Landing is on the front lines, as I said, doing incredibly important work, and we all owe him a great debt of gratitude for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Wayne Walker from my institution, the Woods Hole Research Center. Dr. Walker is an ecologist and a remote sensing specialist who works on applications of satellite imagery to the assessment and monitoring of temperate and tropical ecosystems at regional to global scales. He builds institutional capacity and the tools and techniques used to measure and monitor forests, working in collaboration with governments, NGOs, indigenous communities across the tropics and beyond. That work has brought him, just in the last year, from Peru to Nepal. Dr. Walker holds degrees in forest ecology and remote sensing from the University of Michigan, and he is going to speak today about the next generation, the future of remote sensing. And one quick announcement, if there's anyone who needs a translation, any Spanish speakers in the audience, headsets back there, and we have translation active.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I'd like to begin my presentation right where Landing left off, emphasizing one of the points he made in his concluding remarks. And that is, while countries like the DRC and organizations like OSFAC are working very hard all over the tropics to bring the best available data to bear on the challenge of forest carbon monitoring in this post-Paris implementation phase, focused on all the acronyms that we know so well, NDCs, REDD+, important gaps remain. And degradation is perhaps one of the greatest gaps where forest carbon monitoring is concerned, particularly in places like the DRC, where forest degradation is probably more important in terms of the country as a whole than deforestation is. Now, over the past decade, our community of remote sensing specialists and forest monitoring specialists has become increasingly astute at tracking losses in forest area, otherwise known as deforestation. And for even a longer period of time, going back decades, we've been very good and continue to be very good at establishing and maintaining large forest inventories all across the tropics and all across the globe. And in these forest inventory plots, we're able to track changes in forest carbon. And so where the IPCC is concerned, guidance tells us that we take our activity data, our area information from area loss, we take our carbon density information from plots, also known as emission factors, and we combine the two, and we're able to plug them into an equation that looks something like this to get at gross carbon emissions. Now, as I've suggested, we can do a very good job with this left-hand portion of the equation, the portion that focuses on deforestation. But unfortunately, we're quite lacking on the right-hand side of the equation, particularly because when it comes to tracking area loss at the fine scales needed to capture degradation, we're doing a very poor job, all right? Now, at the Woods Hole Research Center, over the past 5 or so years, we've focused on the carbon side, on the emission factor side, bringing field data, forest inventory data together with satellite data to make maps like the one you see here. This is a map from 2007. It was actually published in Nature Climate Change in 2012 by Baccini et al. It was produced at a resolution of 500 meters, and at the time was the highest resolution map of its kind, spanning the entire Pantropics. Now, more recently, we've increased the resolution of this map to 30 meters for the tropics, and by early 2017, we will have produced the map globally at 30 meters. Now, instead of producing this particular 30-meter map for 2007, we produced it for the 2000 timeframe. Why did we do that? Well, we did it so that we could combine it with the best available forest loss information out there from Hansen et al., which was published in 2013. And when we put these two together, we have our emission factor data, we have our activity data, and we can combine them to get at annual gross emissions from forest carbon loss. And the animation you see here for a region in Brazil shows forest carbon loss increasing over time. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see years increasing incrementally. Below that, you can see the sum of forest carbon loss over time, up to about 25 teragrams for this 50 by 50 kilometer region in Brazil. Now, in 2015, Zarin et al. Completed a similar analysis for the entire Pantropics using these two data sets. Again, annual gross emissions from forest cover loss. And with that data, he was able to produce graphs like the ones you see here for individual countries, showing trajectories of forest carbon loss over time. And you could also do this jurisdictional scales for provinces, for states. But here we have 12 different countries. Up in the upper right, for example, you can see the DRC, and you can see forest cover loss increasing quite significantly over the past few years. On the top row there, you see Mexico, where we're seeing more of a modest decline over time. And finally, in the lower right, you see Costa Rica, where things have been relatively flat over time, relatively no change. But obviously, this approach, as I've already suggested, has its limitations, okay? I've already talked about degradation, and the issue with degradation versus deforestation in the monitoring context is where deforestation is concerned, the damage has already been done. The forest is already lost, and from an intervention standpoint, there's only so much that can be done, certainly in the short term, to get that forest back. It's no longer there. Whereas in the case of degradation, hope remains. By definition, degradation is where we have a decrease in carbon stocks and forest remaining forest. So the forest is still there, it's degraded. But if we know where that is and we can track it, we can go in, we can intervene, and we can try to stem the tide of that degradation so that it doesn't become eventual deforestation. So there's a real opportunity there if we know where that degradation is happening. There's another limitation with these standard approaches, and that is they don't take into account typically gains, particularly gains from growth and uptake. And increasingly, as we see forests as an important mitigation tool as we move forward as a bridge to a fossil fuel-free future, and we speak about negative emissions and using forests as a negative emission strategy, it's important that we're able to track also gains in addition to the losses which we tend to focus on, unfortunately. So what are we doing at the Woods Hole Research Center? Well, we're attempting slowly but surely to shift the paradigm. And we're starting by thinking about the extent to which we can address this activity data issue, address the extent to which we really need to focus on forest area change. And the question is, what if we could just do away with forest area change estimation altogether? Whereas in the context of current practice, it's important, it's rather error prone, particularly where degradation is concerned. It's almost impossible because the scales at which degradation is happening are so fine. So there's a great deal of error associated with the area calculation. So what if we could just focus on the emission factor side, or more specifically on the carbon stock change side, which is really, after all, what we're after. And if we could focus on the estimation of both gains and losses, instead of just estimating gross carbon emissions, we could instead get at net carbon emissions, which where the atmosphere is concerned, where climate change is concerned, that's ultimately what we're really after. And in so doing, there becomes increasingly less need to differentiate between deforestation and forest degradation. So how are we attempting to go about this? Well, we come back to our map of 2007 biomass density at 500 meters. If we zoom in on an area in Brazil, we see what that map looks like. Darker greens represent areas of higher carbon stock, darker reds, areas of lower carbon stock. And the question is, what if we could reproduce this annually? This represents, of course, a single snapshot in time for 2007, but what if we could produce it annually? What if we could go back in time? What if we could go forward in time and generate a time series? If we had this time series of annual data, we could then drill down at the pixel level and look at trajectories of change over time at the pixel level, much like Zarin et al. Did at the national level. So what would that look like if we drilled down at the individual pixel? And just for reference, an individual 500 by 500 meter pixel is about 21.5 hectares. Well, these are what those trajectories might look like. Again, at the pixel level, the individual black dots represent estimates of carbon stock or biomass for that year. The blue line represents our algorithmic fit of those estimates, and the gray envelope represents uncertainty at the 95% confidence interval. And so what we're able to do here is not only track change at the pixel level, but also associate an uncertainty estimate with each pixel. And so at the top, you can see a pixel that's gradually increasing in terms of carbon storage over time. In the middle, you see a pixel that's declining, first quite precipitously and then gradually. And finally, at the bottom, you see a pixel that's very stable, a location where gains or losses are not significant. So what does this look like in map form? Here you see a portion of a map that we've generated for Peru. What you see here in darker shades of red are regions of carbon stock loss. In green, you see regions of carbon stock gain, and in yellow, you see the regions that are stable. Now, for comparison purposes, I'd like to overlay the Hansen et al. Forest cover loss data in black. All right, and I'm going to toggle back and forth, and what you can see is the relationship that exists between forest cover loss and the regions that are the brightest shades of red. Now, this shouldn't come as any big surprise. The brightest shades of red are the regions where forest has been lost, and therefore the most carbon has been lost. But if we look around those regions that are shown in black, we see areas that are still remaining forest, but yet carbon has been depleted. And these are areas where we're seeing forest degradation. All right? So we've begun to scale this up, generating maps across larger areas of above ground biomass change, tracking gains and losses from both deforestation and degradation and disturbance. This is a map of the Amazon basin. And at this point, I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Chris Meyer, who's going to talk about a new project that we're involved in, funded by NORAD, and how we're applying this particular data set in the context of that project.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you also everyone here for attending. It's an exciting day here, and especially I think all this science that is going to be a very useful tool, I think, in the policy processes to help us make better decisions going forward. And importantly, I think for the indigenous peoples who are living in these forests, and we need to help support. So I'm going to elaborate here a little bit more on and present more about an exciting initiative like Wayne just mentioned, of a consortium, a novel consortium put together between Environmental Defense Fund, the coordinating organization of the indigenous peoples of the Amazon Basin, COICA, the the Amazon Network of Geo-Referenced Socioeconomic Environmental Information, or RISC, so that's a mouthful, that is attempting again to put the use of this new cutting edge science into the actual policy process and support indigenous peoples in their advocacy efforts for their protect their territories, to get the recognition they need for their indigenous territories, and conserve the forests within them. So the story though starts about 8 years ago when in this consortium, which is a much smaller grouping with COICA, worked with the Woods Hole and the Environmental Defense Fund to start to learn how to teach indigenous leaders about actually measuring the biomass in their forests. And this was actually a tool to help them understand about the policy approaches called the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation, or REDD+. We then moved on in 2013 and asked, again, this Amazonian Network of Geo-Referenced Socio and Environmental Information, or RISC, to partner with us because we knew they had this data set here, which is basically the boundaries for the Amazon Basin of all the indigenous territories, recognized and not recognized, in addition to natural protected areas. And could we overlay the initial 2007 biomass data on the indigenous territories and produce a product or analysis that the indigenous peoples, or COICA, could use to demonstrate to their countries, to the policymakers, how much forest carbon stocks or biomass they actually have in their indigenous territories, and give them more support and scientific data behind their advocacy and show the importance of that. So we took this data set and then overlaid, again, that initial Woods Hole biomass of 2007, and this is the result we got. This is visual. Behind it, though, we created, again, did the analysis of actually the quantity of biomass or forest carbon stocks in indigenous territories. And we together, again, this is a scientific organization from the north, a policy organization like EDF from the north too, working together with COICA, network of indigenous organizations from the Amazon, to put together a journal article in a prestigious peer-reviewed scientific journal and published it. Some other authors are here too. Edwin Campos, the Director General of COICA, was one of the authors, in addition to Wayne and myself, and produced this journal article for the Lima COP, which basically, again, told the story of how much forest carbon that is located in indigenous territories. This, of course, was a very important COP for COICA, for the world. The Peruvian government, of course, in Peru has a lot of important tropical forests for carbon stock storage. But this gave them, again, in this space, COICA was able to use the launch of this article to draw attention to their policy objectives around, again, recognizing their indigenous territories, protecting their forests. It generated a significant amount of media from all over the world, press interviews for the indigenous leaders, and again, supported their advocacy efforts. So that was a first round of basically this consortium working together. It was this product. Everyone felt it was a success. And then we started discussing with Woods Hole again, okay, well, what are new products, science analysis, are you guys going to have coming forward that maybe we could be able to use again in this type of consortium and put that analysis in the policy process and assist COICA with their advocacy. So we all got together again, and Wayne and Woods Hole started to discuss with us, again, this new report, that new analysis that Wayne just discussed around the biomass change. And so we decided to write a proposal, and we're lucky enough to have the Norwegian government finance, basically over the next 4 years, us to have a version 2.0 of this, you might say. This means that there's now resources for COICA to work with its national organizations in 4 countries: Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil, to take this data with, we're going to focus in on the biomass change in their countries. And again, reports are going to put out every year. And they're going to be able to use that as a focus for their advocacy efforts in the national level RED Plus implementation processes and policy-making processes that are occurring now. This is very timely now. You know, for example, in Colombia, the Colombian government has bilateral and multilateral deals with the German government, Norway, UK. Same thing in Peru, Ecuador. Ecuador's just announced a $41 million funding from the GCF to implement their RED Plus programming. So this is all tools now that COICA and their national organization, COMFINAE, in the case of Ecuador, can use to go to those discussions where the government's going to be deciding how to distribute these resources, where to put the programming, and every year say, hey, these are the changes that are happening. These are maybe the impacts that are happening from your activities. We need to really focus on supporting our indigenous brothers and sisters in these areas, and these are the reasons why. We have the most up-to-date data here. So Wayne showed this slide a little earlier, again, on that change. Imagine now, we haven't gotten to it yet with our RISE partners who, again, have the boundaries because they just came out with this data, Woods Hole. So we're going to layer on, again, imagine what we had previously with this change on top of this map, putting indigenous territories in overlaid on this. I think an example of maybe a product we could be, again, that we'll be using in the future, and you'll see, is something like this recording. And you have here a cutout of the Xingu area in Brazil, an indigenous territory, a protected area. And if I hit play, you can start to see the change. Even in that cutout, in the far picture, you can see the boundary of the Xingu indigenous territory, and of course, the significant biomass change of forest carbon stock outside of the territory. Whereas inside, over those years, there's significantly less. Okay, so, well, of course, this is what it is showing us is the importance of indigenous territories to protect our forest carbon stocks, which of course is key for mitigating climate change. So we're imagining doing this for every year almost, for Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil. And again, These are products that the indigenous leaders of those countries will have at their fingertips to go to the media, to go to the policymakers, of course, to advocate for the policy changes that they need to ensure their cultural survival and growth, but also protecting the important forests in their territories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. To our more astute audience members, you'll have noticed that there was a slight change in schedule. Unfortunately, one of our speakers couldn't make it, and Chris Meyer, who is from the Environmental Defense Fund, as he just covered, is senior manager there for tropical forest policy, was a great friend of the Woods Hole Research Center, longtime partner, and stepped in, and we very much appreciate that and his great presentation. We're now going to transition to a panel setup, so I would invite the panelists to come join us on stage. I'm going to introduce just a few additional people who did not speak initially, but are going to join us up here. Lourdes Hipa is a member of the Quijos indigenous group in Ecuador. She was recently elected vice president of the Confederation of Indigenous Peoples of the Ecuadorian Amazon, which I believe is Confenyai. Her organization is part of COICA, and she has been advocating for some time for indigenous rights and political positions at multiple levels. We're also joined by Tuntiak Katan, who's also from Confenyai and who has been involved deeply in Red Plus discussions with the Ecuadorian government. And do we have Melaine? We do have Melaine, yes. And Melaine Kermark is a colleague of mine from the Woods Hole Research Center and is a project manager for our Project Equateur in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which works to avoid deforestation. So I'm going to start with a few questions just to get things rolling, and then we invite any questions from the audience. And I'm going to begin with Chris, if you don't mind. We just heard your presentation, so I think it'll be a nice transition to go immediately to what I want to ask you, which is, where are the opportunities in national level processes for this technology? That's on.
Yeah. Thank you. I think in a general level right now, and thinking about where these are going, REDD+, or reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, is at a key place in a lot of countries because we're starting to think about implementation and finalizing what are called the national strategies. And each country needs to create a national strategy for implementation, actually submit it here to the UNFCCC process. And those processes are basically mandated to be multi-stakeholder. So indigenous peoples are engaging right now, and if they're not, they should be being invited to the table to help design the national strategy, which is looking at, okay, what are the specific activities that we're going to undertake at a country level, policies, processes, activities to actually reduce deforestation and degradation. So in Peru, I think actually, sorry, Peru just launched their national strategy, but Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil, there's opportunities to engage in those national level processes again, and I think this is where this data is going to assist them to have the most impact and ensure their inclusion and just distributed benefits, you might say, in those national strategies and when they're getting finalized. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So the next question I want to direct over to Lourdes and Tuntiak. How can this new data, this new scientific data, enhance your advocacy efforts to defend your territories and peoples in Ecuador?
Nyupapunda, Alipunja Nisha, Kangunara, Makitakuni, Nyukashutimian Lourdes Hipa, Nyukashamuni, Ecuador, Mamayactamanda, Napo. Buenos días. Mi nombre es Lourdes Hipa. Mi nacionalidad es Quijos de Napo, de la Amazonía ecuatoriana, como vicepresidenta de la CONFENIAE de la región amazónica. Estos datos científicos a nosotros nos ayudarían mucho a los dirigentes en la actualidad de las nacionalidades indígenas para nosotros poder incidir. Más o menos sabemos cuánto es el estimado de carbono que tenemos en nuestros territorios, que es muy importante. Si nosotros tenemos bosques, nosotros somos los guardianes de la selva. Entonces nosotros con esos datos podríamos acudir ante las instituciones públicas para poder ser nosotros quienes hagamos gestiones de proyectos a nivel local, nacional e internacional.
Tuntia?
Sí, para complementar la respuesta, nosotros los pueblos indígenas entendemos estas medidas, estos datos, porque en esta alianza no es que solo los científicos nos dan la información. En esta alianza hemos generado capacidades de los pueblos indígenas en temas técnicos científicos, basados desde nuestra ciencia. En este sentido, utilizando estos datos, entendiendo el panorama nacional, los programas nacionales en tema de cambio climático, tenemos la capacidad ya de dialogar con los tomadores de decisiones a nivel técnico y a nivel político. Entonces, estas herramientas nos ayudan a hacer una mejor incidencia como organizaciones y pueblos indígenas y hablar en el mismo lenguaje y trabajar de manera conjunta con los estados, con los ministerios que ya están llevando programas, pero al mismo nivel entendiendo el programa nacional y global.
Thank you. So Melaine, I want to turn to you now. And from your work in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Equator province, when you look at a new technology like this, what in your mind are the biggest challenges you face in implementing?
Thanks, Dave. For me, it's really exciting to see the science, but I'm thinking as a project manager on how do we implement REDD and how do we make REDD a reality to conserve forest. And I think the main hurdle, the main challenge we had running our pilot REDD project in the DRC was capacities. At provincial level, there's a real capacity issue. We do not find the local experts that are capable of implementing the project and mastering this scientific knowledge. And I think in the future, in order to make REDD a reality, to empower those local communities and to make sure that the REDD process is really appropriated, we really need to think about capacity building. To put back in context, DRC is the size of Western Europe. There's the infrastructure are very limited, so travel is a real issue. And we find that even people that are trained in Kinshasa, who might have certain master of those tools, are not willing to come to Equateur. So really what we're looking into is to work with local universities and train directly at a local level the expert we need in order to make REDD reality and conserve those forests.
Thank you. And then landing, I would take that province level view that Melaine just shared with us and then ask your perspective in Kinshasa. What are the biggest challenges you face?
Thank you, David. The challenges are, I think the first one is access to data. Because as you may know, satellite data is very, very expensive. So you have problem to access this satellite data. Sometimes we can find this data in the United States, in Europe, but we have to download this data. How to do it? With internet limitation. Data are free, but you have problem to download it because internet is connection is very low. So this is one of our problem. The second one is validation. We have many information from satellite data, but I think you have to validate this data. For that, we need to go on the field to collect this data. With insecurity, it's sometimes very, very difficult to validate this data. So the one other problem is, I told about that, Walker talked about that, is degradation. degradation is a very, 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 touch very, very low, small area. It's a species in DRC. If you use some kind of satellite data, you have a problem to detect this degradation. Maybe you have to use high resolution data to be able to monitor degradation. And the last one maybe will be to improve communication between high-level government in local community. If you miss this link, you will have problem to protect forests in Congo Basin. Thank you.
Okay, at this point, I would invite anyone in the audience. We don't have a traveling mic, but if you project your question, I can repeat it for the panelists. So just put your hand up. Yes, please. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll do the woman here, and then we'll move up to you. Okay, so one and then two. Yes. Oh, we do have a traveling mic.
You have to turn it on.
Yep. Chris, can you repeat her question if she asked it in Spanish? Can you repeat it in English?
Ese de ahí funciona.
Oh, we have one on this. We have coming down to you on this side.
Hola, hablo en español. Soy de Paraguay. También, como muchos saben, tenemos un proceso muy grande de deforestación. Y asistiendo a varios eventos, vimos que degradación es el tema en común. Nosotros tenemos muchos datos de imágenes, utilizamos el Google Earth Engine como un software libre y creamos varios mapas de bosque, no bosque y cambios. Incluso queremos meter nuestra información en el Global Forest Watch para tener información no oficial y tener los mapas de Hansen. Ahora, cuando hablamos de degradación, ese es un tema que nos preocupa, porque con la resolución de 30 metros, como estuvo mencionando, no se puede verificar la degradación. Me encantó el tema de datos de actividad y factores de emisión. ¿Cómo podemos trabajar en eso? Nosotros hicimos un inventario forestal nacional, trabajamos con pueblos indígenas también, y pudimos ver factores socioeconómicos, biodiversidad, hicimos mediciones en terreno, y eso queremos mezclar con los temas de datos de actividad y factores de emisión. O sea, tener datos de terreno mezclado con imágenes satelitales y ver cómo hacer degradación. Ahora, nosotros también estamos en Red Plus y eso no está definido. Eso es un tema que a nosotros nos preocupa y que veo que le preocupa a otros países. No está definida la degradación. ¿Cómo hablamos todavía de degradación en nuestros países si no tenemos un concepto claro? Entonces, yo creo que es un tema que deberemos discutir, cómo se hace hoy la degradación y considerar eso, considerar las alianzas que también tienen los pueblos indígenas. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. One moment, we're gonna. So, can you, Wayne, in answering the question, can you just, for the non-Spanish speakers, kind of quickly summarize what the question was? Or perhaps Chris, thank you.
I captured your question. I think he did too. But your last part of it was, how can we work together to create a definition of degradation, and maybe with indigenous peoples too, right?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. Were you asking it of anyone in particular, or can Dr. Walker field? No. Okay.
I think that's a really good question. And I think where degradation is concerned, you can look at it from different perspectives. And of course, as someone focused on forest monitoring, bringing to bear satellite data on the problem, I tend to look at it, of course, from a technical point of view. And that means coming up with a definition that of something measurable. And so in the case of the work here, the definition that we've used is very simple, but yet technical. It's areas where you have biomass loss, carbon stock loss in forest, remaining forest. And so from our perspective, that's a real measurable definition and something that we can sort of wrap our arms around and throw our data at, and it will stick. That said, you raise an important issue, which is at national levels, particularly when working with multiple stakeholders and so on, like indigenous peoples in particular, the definition that I might use of what's measurable has to meet policy. And I think there needs to be more discussion at the national level, perhaps in conjunction with folks like us, to bring these two sort of worlds together. What is measurable, what is practical in terms of data, but then how do we meld that into policy? I guess that's my short answer.
Thank you. And so we kept the microphone right there because they're right next door, and then we're going to come up to you for the next question. But yes, go ahead, sir.
Christoph Thies, Greenpeace. I have a slightly related question, I guess also mostly to Wayne and Chris. The new Sentinel data from the European Space Agency satellite, which, if I'm not mistaken, go down to a 10-meter resolution. How much can they improve the monitoring of degradation and your work? And if yes, what kind of products can you do also using those data by when?
I think there's great potential. It's something that we're just starting to look at now. Obviously, the work I described here is at 500 meters. We're also looking to use Landsat at 30 meters, but certainly the next step is absolutely Sentinel. So I think there's great potential. It's something that, as I said, we're just getting started on, but there's no question that's the direction I think that we should be looking.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I work in the Upper Amazon in the Peruvian department of San Martin, in collaboration with an indigenous group whose representative is here, Codipisam. And the situation there is that the land distribution is such that slash and burn is absolutely not sustainable. And the leadership, indigenous leadership, has asked me to, in my center, to provide an alternative to slash and burn. And what my question to the experts is whether they believe that the 4 per 1,000 regenerative agriculture launched in Paris by the Lima Paris Agenda Action Group can give a permanent agriculture alternative to slash and burn, because slash and burn now is a serious cause of deforestation and, of course, climate warming in the region I work. So I want your opinion on the effectiveness of this very recent endeavor of the 4 per 1,000 regenerative agriculture for the purpose of providing affordable, simple, and effective alternative, permanent agriculture alternative to slash and burn.
Thank you very much. And was that to a particular panel?
Clearly, those who could address this could be anybody, but it would be Landing and Walker, from what I heard, or perhaps Chris as well.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, and I hope my colleagues from Quaker and Confinai might discuss. I'll give you a second, but think about the other economic activities that you guys are thinking about, in order to ensure protection of your forest. You want to go? I'll let them speak first, and then I'll add some observations.
Así es, nosotros como Confeniae, como dirigentes, también tenemos un reto muy grande que velar por todas las nacionalidades. Y nosotros, yo como mujer, hemos planteado, en Ecuador sabemos que existe el extractivismo del petróleo, la minería, donde nuestra gente indígena de los territorios somos despojados de los territorios. Entonces, ante estos atropellos que son vulnerados nuestros derechos, nosotros hemos dicho a este gobierno, no queremos el extractivismo, no queremos minería, porque nosotros tenemos territorios. Nosotros queremos fortalecer nuestra identidad, nuestra cultura, nuestra cosmovisión. Entonces hemos presentado proyectos de, como usted dice, de agricultura, la chacra tradicional, donde nosotros podemos ejercer todos, en medicina natural, en medicina, que nosotros tenemos nuestros propios alimentos. También tenemos que ejercer las habilidades de las mujeres, las artesanías, a comenzar a recolectar las semillas y buscar mercados para apoyarles a ellas, para que puedan vender y así generar economía, ¿no? Y también queremos fortalecer el turismo comunitario, porque nuestros bosques son inmensos, tienen un sinnúmero de biodiversidad. Entonces nosotros podemos hacer eso. Por eso decimos no al extractivismo, pero sí a buscar las alternativas. Y se están dando, tenemos el apoyo, sino que lo que hace falta es que nosotros como dirigentes y los líderes de cada comunidad tengamos la capacidad para poder gestionar, dar seguimiento a esos proyectos.
So if I could maybe elaborate a little bit more, because I do think the case of Ecuador maybe is a little bit similar in certain places to your context in San Martin in Peru. I am not familiar with all the details of the initiative, sorry, that you listed there in Paris that was launched last year, but and what I'm also not familiar with the details, for example, of the Peruvia's national strategy for Red Plus, which my understanding though is in that strategy, there's a recognition of small-scale slash and burn agriculture as maybe, I think, is one of the main drivers of deforestation and the need to address it in order to achieve their goals. So I would hope in that national strategy, there is a recognition of that and a set of course, activities or policies that they want to use to address that might, square with the initiative you're talking about. In general, if I can, I think what's important, of course, is we need to provide livelihoods for an alternative for these, which I think, of course, you're looking at more specific activities in that context. And a lot of the times, I think what we speak about here is important to that is access to finance and more direct finance in order to finance those activities that or intensify the production on the existing land or finance other alternatives like Lourdes just began. So I think what we would like to see, and I don't know if that's a part of, again, what your initiative mentions there, but if there's not a financial component that's linked to it, that we have a source of funds. And of course, that is what Red Plus is trying to do in one sense, is bring more funds into the sector to support those different types of activities. We're not going to, I think, have a lot of success, unfortunately. So I hope that gives you a little bit of some observations on that. Sorry.
Yeah, Tuntiak would like to add something as well.
Quiero complementar lo que dijo Chris y Lourdes. En caso ecuatoriano, por ejemplo, tenemos a nivel nacional el Programa Nacional Red, que ya es una política pública nacional. Pero en ese marco nosotros tenemos nuestras propias iniciativas sostenibles de manera holística. Tenemos algunos paisajes identificados, en este caso 3 paisajes muy importantes, altos en biodiversidad, que son considerados puntos calientes biológicamente, que es en la Amazonía Sur, Centro y Norte. En este caso uno de ellos es Yasuní. Ahí nosotros estamos planteando una iniciativa holística, que por supuesto hay que hacer la medida de carbono, pero hay otros servicios ecosistémicos que están en ese bosque y en las comunidades. Entonces, nosotros estamos planteando que nuestra iniciativa de gestión holística o red indígena amazónica sea reconocida, sea presupuestada y apoyada por estas políticas públicas a nivel nacional. Estamos teniendo conversaciones en la Mesa Nacional Red, estamos teniendo conversaciones con los especialistas y técnicos en temas relacionados con el Ministerio del Ambiente y estamos incidiendo para llegar a ciertos acuerdos para que estas propuestas de las nacionalidades sean apoyadas y sean reconocidas a nivel nacional.
Melaine, could we get your thoughts on this as well?
Yes, I'm familiar with the initiative you talked about. I think it's a very interesting initiative, but I'm waiting to see how it's actually going to play out and how the funds are going to come in. In DRC, as Landing said, slash and burn agriculture is the main cause of deforestation. But from a field level perspective, you really have to understand that slash and burn agriculture has a logic to it. It's actually a very efficient way to fertilize the soil, and the context is, the socio-economic context is changing, and it's becoming a real issue. Now, to go back to capacity building, I think really what we need is to have local experts in the agricultural sector that can work with those communities and indigenous leaders or even indigenous leaders that can benefit from those capacity building in order to transfer that knowledge and really shift the agricultural practices to something that's more sustainable. We are doing some experiments in the DRC, working with, for example, palm oil, which is, I know, very controversial, but we're looking at very small scale for local consumption, looking at rice production using the system of rice intensification. We have some very good results. But we are fundamentally, what we're looking at is transforming a system that is more a hunter-gatherer system with a component of agriculture through the shifting slash and burn agriculture into a real agricultural system. And that's changes that, you know, will take decades. We're changing the building foundation or the cultural foundation in a way of those communities. And that cannot be done without indigenous people and local leaders, and without also bringing some capacity, helping them maybe develop some capacity through local university and others.
Okay.
Thank you for making the connection to the Congo, and I think Landing would have something to add to that.
Okay, thank you. I want to add something. It's about slash and burn. I think why these local people make this kind of activity. It's more easy for them. You cut and you have your production, and the coming year you exchange. This is a bad thing. But how to do? I think you want to diversify, intensify agriculture to help them to remain in the same area. But how to do it? The challenge will be there, maybe intensification and diversification. So for that, you have to improve soil fertility. So how to do it? I don't know if you have to use a chemical, no, because it will bring another problem for this area. I think also is diversification. Maybe in the same area, we can have plantation. In the same area, deforested, you can have plantation. If you have plantation, maybe population will be in this area, not cut forests. And also, I think is the market. If you produce, you have to be able to sell your production. And as you may know, in this Congo basin, it's difficult to move. You have to move by rivers because the road is sometimes impracticable. So how to improve access to market for these people? I think if we intensify, diversify activity, and improve market access in this area, maybe we will be avoid forest loss and forest degradation in the Congo basin.
You know, that's a provocative question when you get 5 out of 6 panelists who want to answer it. Thank you. We're going to go over here for a moment, then we'll come back to you, sir. Yes.
Good morning. I'm John Hontley. I work for the Forest Stewardship Council. So FSC, as many of you know, is an organization that helps foresters for sustainable forest management through a certification system. It's for individual foresters, but also for group foresters, groups of foresters and communities. We, in our new national standards that start to be applied from this year, we have special attention for maintenance of carbon stocks and biomass in forest, but we use a traditional way of verification, certification bodies that do on-site visits and so on, but we're also looking for other ways of verification. So, and we also are developing a specific certification system or additional requirements for ecosystem services certification. So I'm interested in knowing how this method that you've been developing, how it can also be used to measure whether certified forests are complying with our requirements, and if so, what needs to be done on the ground in addition to using your maps?
Who would like to handle that question? Wayne.
Well, if I understand your question correctly, I think certainly this approach and approaches like it can be used to the extent that the accuracy is sufficient and the uncertainty is low enough to track carbon stock changes in certified forests. The extent to which approaches like this can be implemented in the context of existing certification processes and so on. I mean, I think that's something that remains to be seen and will have to sort of be worked out over time. It's not something that I'm necessarily an expert on, but I think in general terms, there's certainly a place for approaches like this to play a role.
Anyone else would like to add to that? Or okay, thank you very much, Wayne. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Martin Harrow from Wageningen University. I'm also a technical person. Thank you very much for the presentation. My first comment would be, because there was a question about the ESA, the Sentinels satellites, and if people are interested, there's a side event just after this one at the same room from the European Space Agency. So if you're interested, you can stick around and get a bit more information on what's happening here. I'd like to pick up on the ends that were the previous two questions were asked related to that. Our experience when trying to use satellite observations with communities is that there's less interest from the communities in actually biomass or carbon, but much more about the activities. So slash and burn, all kinds of activities that change the forest, because that's much closer to the way they're doing it, just carbon, which is to many communities kind of this strange concept, so to say, on the local level. And so I was wondering why you chose this way. I mean, you have 500-meter carbon change, pixels, so to say, and why, but maybe there was a certain reason. I actually tried to understand why you chose this way, not the one really going for activities and that kind of stuff. So the second question related to that is then the intriguing part of this approach is actually you can get to direct estimation of emissions. I think that's intriguing, and I think in the technical community, that's where things go. We have that ambition to go to more pixel-based estimation and all that kind of stuff. What do you see the potential of that? So, I mean, oftentimes when you use these large area products for local purposes, the uncertainties can be very high. They are still relatively high, but I would like to see your vision on that. I mean, how can we reduce uncertainties? How can we move forward? How can we use these things not only in kind of as a communication tool, an empowerment tool, the way you use it now, but more as in towards even an actual estimation tool? You see how that goes.
Great questions, Martin. So let me take the first one. I think, I mean, I appreciate the point you're making about sort of the coarseness of this particular data set in the context of working with indigenous peoples and local communities, and at first blush, the scales seem to be a little bit off, perhaps. But I think what's important in the context of this particular NORAD-funded project, at least, we're looking across, well, essentially across the entire Amazon basin. And we're using this data, albeit at 500 meters, to look at the role that these territories, the existence of these territories, have played in preserving forest carbon stocks. Now, obviously, forest carbon stocks are but one ecosystem service. We certainly know that and appreciate that. But again, it's something that we can measure, we think, reasonably well. And so, the question is, with data like this, apart from its scale, when we're looking across large areas, across many, many hundreds of indigenous territories, what sorts of questions can we ask and can we answer? And where the existence of these indigenous territories are concerned, where land tenure rights are concerned, can we better nail down the role that the presence of territories have to play on the one hand, and then looking at types of territories, where there's tenure, where there isn't tenure, what sort of differences do those more policy-related issues play in terms of carbon. And so at the scales that we're working, we think it certainly makes sense. But I do appreciate, where the rubber meets the road is certainly activities on the ground. Getting to your second question, sort of the vision moving forward. Again, a good question, and obviously, given the resolution of the data, given the scales that we're working, when you start looking at individual pixels, you're going to find error for sure. And so, how are we looking already at ways to try to beat down that error? Well, first of all, obviously more and better data, all right? Potentially higher resolution data, although higher resolution data isn't necessarily sort of the panacea. We actually tend to see uncertainties often increase as the resolution increases. But the other approach that we're looking at is, okay, not just higher resolution, not just any one sensor, but multiple sensors from multiple sources, whether it be optical, whether it be radar, even LiDAR potentially. Bringing that all to bear, and if you remember the slide where I showed those trajectories at the pixel level, you can imagine a strategy where you carve the tropics or even the globe up into a grid of some size. Let's say it's 100 meters or something more practical. And then you take whatever data you have and you throw it at that grid, and you build up these points in that trajectory over time. And the more points you have from the more different data sets, assuming you can understand how everything works and so on, to decrease that uncertainty. So that's one approach, but it's certainly something that needs a lot more work, for sure.
Thank you. So it looks like those are the questions that we have. Would anyone else like? We have probably time for one more. And if not, I will just wrap up. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Build a little bit on Wayne's response, Martin, and I want to go back to this slide here, which was, again, when we partnering with our colleagues at the network of mastering the name, the socioeconomic geo-referenced network that does also additionally, all this pink here, for example, is pressures and threats data that they have, and they have concessions that are looking at some of this broader activity, and they're going to be updating that soon. And so that's, again, where this interesting part is we'll be getting an annual update from Woods Hole of biomass change, and they'll be updating also, not every year, but over a couple of years, kind of some of this activity data, some of it, of better quality than others, but they should also, because they're also basically aggregating it up from at the country level, they can decide which one and analyze which one is more relevant or not, and begin to tease out a little bit, okay, are we seeing these roads or dam projects where they're cutting roads near indigenous territories? What does that do? Or the oil concessions, petroleum concessions, the mining concessions, and tease that out a little bit better. Again, identify maybe the impacts on biomass loss around or in indigenous territories. And again, that's, of course, interesting tool for indigenous peoples to draw attention to that whole strategy to, okay, hey, this activity or this set of actors is really a problem, or your new policy that's allowing this set of actors or incentives. Look, we see that the change, this, of course, does not fit with your national determined contribution and your set of activities or your Red Plus strategy. I don't know what. Okay. So not perfect, but I think it gives us some credible analysis that we can do around that. And that is part of the projected products we imagine having here in the next couple of years.
Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead, Landing.
Yeah, it's about data. I think you have many data, many information from carbon estimation, but we have to not forget validation. Many information come from satellite. So how to validate this data? Because we need field information. So I think some tools like LiDAR, like field inventory can help to validate all data, all the satellite data we have. So you have to put these links between field and satellite to have the accurate data to help policies makers. Thank you.
Yes, Tuntiak, please.
Yo quiero hacer referencia en cuanto a medición de carbono y cómo los pueblos indígenas se identifican con esto. Como COICA y como sus bases en 9 países de la cuenca amazónica, hemos dicho, claro, en nuestros bosques hay carbono, pero nosotros estamos más allá de eso solamente. Ese es un servicio ambiental solamente, pero en nuestros bosques hay mucho más. En esta alianza, nuestros expertos son expertos en ese tema, pero también tenemos otros aliados que también son expertos en otros servicios ambientales que también estamos trabajando y también tenemos que desarrollar eso. Por eso, uno de los lineamientos de Red Indígena Amazónica es la macromedición de múltiples servicios ecosistémicos de los bosques. Ese es un lineamiento bien fuerte que está considerado en la COICA. Por otro lado, para complementar a la eficiencia de nuestro trabajo, conjuntamente con Butzol, hemos realizado mediciones en el campo, tanto en Brasil, Perú, Ecuador y Colombia, para consolidar la información satelital y verificar la eficiencia también. Entonces, en un poco más de un año nos hemos dedicado a hacer esas mediciones de campo en parcelas permanentes, lo cual hemos obtenido datos de campo, midiendo los árboles, generalmente la biomasa sobre el suelo. Eso. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. So those are tremendous questions, and this is a great audience, clearly full of people who are very engaged and focused on these issues. We invite you to join us immediately afterwards, just outside for light refreshments and to continue this conversation. I just want to wrap up briefly by referring back to Phil Duffy's opening remarks. He said that if under a Donald Trump presidency, the United States government pulls back on climate leadership, it's going to be up to all of us to step forward. And when you hear a panel like this, you can see very clearly how that can happen. OSFAC, Woods-Hole Research Center, Environmental Defense Fund, Confinai, COICA, that these are leaders and they're pushing forward, and as are all of you. So if you could please join me in thanking them for their comments today and for their work every day, and then we will adjourn. That looks fascinating. Thank you very much.
This is using the FAO, European Union, NGO, and they did an event last year, and I promised to organize one this year. Okay. And this is the paper should be submitted before 6th of December.
Okay.
And we'll try to have something, and forest maybe a large argument of this.
Okay.
And it's much more to build the route toward having a potential way to have global and global high, medium, and low resolution. Right. To find a way of doing it through crowdsourcing or through platform or through tools, whatever it's a business, but we need to try to have something harmonized and everybody feeling.
Yeah.
And this Trump or not, doesn't matter.
Yeah, unfortunately with Trump. So nice to meet you. Thank you very much.
Please advertise that and put
Okay. Absolutely. So nice to meet you. Thank you.
Sorry, just to know, do you do a statement or you are looking some? Yeah. Yeah. And you doing yes, a statement or kind of
Whichever you prefer. You have a statement or I can speak with you.
No, it's just if you organize to do some speech or
Oh, no. I mean like a press statement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because I received an email yesterday from your delegation, from your press team, I mean, and but it's the only thing talking about if you want to organize some interviews, blah, blah, blah. But I want to know if maybe you will release some statement about it.
So I would be happy to send you the statement.
Yeah, you have prepared it.
Yes.
Okay, yes, it will be nice.
You have your card?
No,
Okay.
I
Can you
yeah,
email me?
yeah, okay.
You email me and then I will send it right to you.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
Thank
And what
you.
was your name?
Judith.
Very nice to meet you.
Thank you.
As you talk, I'm going to check this, but I want to hear you.
Okay. Just, I want to have one question about this topic.
Yes.
What's the role of the developed countries to have stopping deforestation in the poor countries? What do you recognize? What do you advise?
I'm not the one that asked that question. I want to introduce you to Elaine. Come with me. I'll introduce you. Tell me your name.
My name is Elias. So I'm the team.
Rim.
Oui, je pense